Today I'm making one of my favorite Stormtrooper armor designs, the Combat Assault Tank Trooper from Season 2 of The Mandalorian. For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, coffee foam, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I'm gonna start with the chest plate, since it's the most defining feature of the armor. I threw together a rudimentary template using scrap cardboard to start out with. I like to figure these out on scrap cardboard first before transferring them to clean cardstock and scanning them in to make them available to you guys. And that's just because there's usually some refinement in this process, and I like to take care of all that refinement work in a more disposable material. I traced that onto EVA foam and cut it out with the razor pen. I'm using standard gray floor mat tile foam so that I don't have to paint. Any opportunity that I can take to reduce the painting time, I'm gonna take. Because you know, a lot of these, they would be one-day builds if it weren't for the painting. Generally, I make my templates in halves so that they can be folded over and each side will come out symmetrical. I cut those out with the work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I sharpened the blade on a sharpening stone with some WD-40. Now that the whole piece is cut out, I can get a good look at it. It didn't look quite right to me, so I widened the neck hole and applied that change to the template prototype. Okay, now I can shape it. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. When it was sufficiently heated up, I simply folded it in half in the front at the bridge and held it in place until it cooled. Then I heat formed the shoulders and the sides in exactly the same way. Next, I made the panel on the front of the chest plate. I cut that out at a slanted angle so that the edge would match up seamlessly with the now three-dimensionally angled main plate. There's an angled slot at the bottom left, stage left, reminiscent of a coin return slot, so I made that by cutting a rectangle, but leaving the bottom length side attached. Then I flipped it over and cut an angled trench in the back along that length so that the section could be angled inward without any kind of resistance. I super glued it to the main chest armor plate before proceeding. Now that the plate was firmly in place, I secured the angled slot using hot glue. I can get away with hot glue here because this is a cosmetic seam. It's not structural. I added a few small details to the slot and then made the external armor detail. Then I brought it over to my pattern mannequin to figure out where the shoulders were gonna lie, and also what refinements needed to be made to the armholes. After I'd repaired them, I was left with the seam that's not supposed to be there, but I'm able to get away with it because it'll be covered up by the buckles. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and get started on those. The straps are actually pretty self-explanatory. They're just strips of foam with very shallow incisions made in them, and then heat formed. I'll get into that a bit more later. Then I made the buckles out of 2mm craft foam, 4mm craft foam, dowel foam, and bevel foam, most of which can be found in craft stores. Then I attached them to the straps and attached the straps to the chest plate. Next, I got to work on the back panel. I made it in essentially the same way as the front panel, but since it's less horseshoe shaped, it was a lot easier to work with as its line of symmetry is more centered. I cut darts in the top and the bottom though, just to make it a bit more rounded. Then I heat formed the heck out of it. To make it a little bit easier, I only did one flank at a time. It's just a lot of surface area to work with, and it's so much easier to do it in halves. Once both sides were rounded, I glued the darts together with super glue. Next, I cut these armhole edges from pieces of scrap EVA foam. These are both cosmetic and will help the armor hold its shape. I mean, they're on the armor in the show, so they're going on the costume. That's why they're there. They're just also functional. There's a detail box on the back, so I got to work on that. I cut the edge of the wall to be curved so that it would sit correctly on the now curved back plate. Then I glued them together. Then I cut the walls of the pack. Unlike the classic Stormtrooper, these walls are taller than they are wide, rectangular if you will. Using these metal rulers, by the way, because plastic or wooden ones will get destroyed by razor pens over time. It's, you know, you're whittling it, essentially. I totally didn't learn that firsthand. I glued that one on, then I flipped my template and repeated the process in order to mirror it and get the other side. When I attached the bottom panel, I realized that I had made the back panel slightly too small, so I increased the length using a strip of floor mat foam, and of course, as always, transferred that change to the template. Next, I cut a panel. It has several cutouts, two of which are identical, so I saved the offcut to make the other one. Actually, I just flipped the template, but the offcuts became useful later on. Then I flipped it over and cut a trench in the back at the same spot as the bend in the pack walls. This will ensure a sharp angular bend as opposed to a curved one. Before I put it in, I want to work on a few things that are just easier to take care of when it's a part like this. You don't need to complicate these things by getting ahead of yourself, you know? I glued panels to the back to conceal the inside and a spacer to the middle so that it wouldn't compress. The right angles don't want to stay that way. So I held them in place with metal blocks while they cooled. When they cooled, I closed up the back of the compartments. There's another cutout in the lower compartment, so I added that as well. Then I added a strip of 2mm foam to frame it. Now for the intricate details. I said the intricate details. This thing is all vents, so let's get started. I built those out of 4mm EVA craft foam and more puzzle strip segments. When they were assembled, I glued them in. Now that's pretty good, but this is Star Wars, so this is not nearly enough techno nonsense. Let's make more vents! Forever and ever vents. I cut a piece of light gray craft foam and marked it up with a Sharpie marker so it looked like even more vents. Then I glued it in with super glue. Still not enough nonsense. There we go. That's just PVC and bevel scraps. But wait, there's more. Exposed wires. What do they do? Who knows and who cares? Okay, there we go. That'll look like I'm wearing an engine. Let's get that in there. I actually had to cut a hole in the back of the original armor plate to accommodate the detail boxes. So I don't know, I guess 4mm craft foam might have been a bit of a better fit. Doesn't really matter. Then I glued it in place. Lastly, for the pack, I added 2 PVC pipe segments to the top. They're actually air hose adapters. This armor was originally designed for the Mud Troopers from the Solo movie, which had these hoses leading up to the helmets. And the helmet is a repainted tank trooper from Rogue One. They're reused. It's mix and match and reuse, which happens more often than you'd think in franchise television, to the extent that some directors will actually have their props destroyed in order to prevent them from showing up somewhere else. Looking at you, Kubrick. Then I added a collar and buckle adapters for the straps. These are fake buckles, but I added real ones to the shoulders in order to accommodate the shoulder armor. Speaking of which, I traced a template for the shoulders onto foam, cut it out. Once it was cut out, I heat formed it with my heat gun. Then I shaped it on a small rounded surface and placed it inside of a large rounded surface so that it would hold on to that shape as it cooled. After it cooled, I glued the seam together with super glue. I repeated those steps for the other shoulder. After that, I got to work on the arms. I made the upper arms using the same process as all the other pieces. They're actually a little easier because they're not curved spherically, they're just tubes. And there are actually no gauntlets on this one, so that makes things easier. I added some strips around the outside using puzzle strips and super glue. I sanded the pattern off of the back in order to get better adhesion. Then I attached the upper arm to the shoulder pauldron with scrap straps and hot glue. I weighted those down with the machinist blocks so that they would cool real fast and not lift. And then there were 2. And that's it for the arms. So let's move on to the shin guards. I got my basic shin template, laid it out on a floor mat. Then I traced that, taking care to include the registration marks, those little triangles. Those will be instrumental in helping me line up the edges. Trace those onto foam, cut them out, heat form them, just like I did with all the previous armor pieces. In order to get these pieces to hold a tubular curved shape, I placed them inside a cardboard carpet tube with a smaller cardboard poster tube in the center to cool. Now that they're both curved, I connected the seam in the front, making sure to align the triangular registration marks so that they'd be even. I made sure to use Sharpie so that they'd be highly visible on the gray foam. I can get away with this because the Stormtrooper armor, as part of its design, has a raised bevel strip in the front and the back of the limb segments, which will hide the seam and any markings close by. I cut those bevel strips out of more puzzle piece strips. I know it seems like I'm using a lot of these, but I haven't even put a dent in my supply yet. I have entirely too many. There's also a bevel at the top by the knee, so after I had covered the seams with the basic bevels, I'm going to need to add a more bulky one to the front. I glued 2 strips of foam together and added walls to either side in order to form a long box shape. When this piece was finished, I glued it to the front of the shin guard, covering that final seat. It's supposed to actually be held on by 2 straps, so I got to work on those next. They're slightly wider than puzzle strips, so I had to actually cut new strips from some scrap foam this time. Then to get the pattern, I cut a series of parallel lines in the strips down their entire length. In order to get them to show up better, I heat formed them with my heat gun. This will allow the lines to open up and also give a nice sheen to the surface of the belts. I left them inside the finished arm pieces to cool. While they cooled, I moved up to the more intricate kneecap parts. But here's a crazy thing about Stormtrooper armor. The knees are asymmetrical on almost all the Stormtrooper variants. Unlike the classic Stormtrooper, both shin guards have some kind of kneecap armor, but one is just a little bit more pronounced than the other. I cut the smaller one from scrap EVA foam and cut trenches in the back so that it would fold correctly. I hot glued it on in the center and super superglued the ends to the shin guard. Then I added a few small details from more pieces of scrap foam. Those white triangles were cut from bevel strips, but I ended up replacing them with gray offcuts because I didn't want to paint on this build. Finally, I attached the straps, and that was actually it for this shin guard. Now let's move on to the one with the needlessly complicated kneecap. I made it essentially the same way as the smaller one, but because there's more surface area, it really wants to pull itself apart. So this time, as it cooled, I leaned weighted paint stir sticks on it while the glue set up. Then I added bevels to the top and some greablies to the bottom, and those ridiculous square pyramid-shaped bolts to the middle. Why, McQuarrie? Why you gotta make my life difficult? Matt Jeffries didn't bother with this greebly nonsense. I glued straps onto this shin guard as well, and made another fake buckle for it. And that's it for the shin guards. After that, I worked on the belt. I'm using 2mm foam for the front-facing portion, which is a little bit wider than the rest of it, and I'm using 1/2" foam for the utility boxes. There are also 2 pouches that hang down from either side. The belt is very similar to the classic Stormtrooper belt, but a couple of the pouches are more directly connected. I think a lot of this armor, it was just designed in a way so that it would be more convenient for the actors to sit down, because most of their scenes, they're inside a truck cab, you know? Now for the helmet. Okay, now a lot of people have done this helmet already. Odin did one. I did one. It was like forever ago. It was like the 4th helmet I'd ever built ever. And you can kind of tell Odin's came out way better. But to be fair, at the time, none of the new movies had come out yet, so my only reference image was at a distance, literally through a cloud of smoke. And as a result, the helmet looks insane. All the details are there, they're just slightly off. Like, it looks like I built it underwater. It's crazy. And I mean, you can follow that tutorial and just correct for my obvious mistakes and still get a reasonable helmet. But I've come a long way since then, so I'm just gonna run through it real quick right here. Because this is legitimately one of my favorite Star Wars helmets, and it's kind of crazy to me that it's not part of my helmet wall yet, you know? First, I made the basic bad guy helmet. All the Star Wars villains have helmets with identical bases. Makes my job easier, sort of like proto-Cylons. Made a lot of my markings using highlighter this time, because it doesn't really show up on gray foam, except under ultraviolet light. So I think I'm good unless I wear this to a rave. Do they have nightclubs on Star Destroyers? The brim, I decided to do in 2 pieces this time. I think when I did the Range Trooper, I did it all at once. Yeah, it came out all right. I had to make the edge that connects to the helmet wall slanted in order to get it to flare out. Well, flare out properly instead of just flat. Then I flipped and traced it to get the other side, and did a little bit of heat forming in order to make it curve. Then I superglued the brim pieces to the side of the helmet. Superglue isn't very forgiving, so I did this in stages in order to make sure I got it right. Then I glued the mandibles, yeah, why not, to the faceplate. Next, I made the blast shield, very similarly to the way I make helmet dome side panels, although I patterned this out just to make sure it was symmetrical. And then I glued it to the forehead. Next, I made the smaller front panels out of 2mm craft foam and glued them on. In order to get the fold in the center, I cut a trench out of the back and glued it shut. Lastly, I put in a piece of 2-liter soda bottle darkened with nightshade spray paint, and I was finished. Now I can steel rhydonium gently. So one of my favorite aspects of this armor is the detail level on the backpack. That's something that I really admire about the Star Wars universe. They don't skimp out on the back of a proper costume just because it's usually not going to be seen by the camera. And so when you do catch a glimpse of it, it really helps to uphold the illusion of the lived-in universe, in my opinion. Additionally, and on a practical note, conventions are more of a summertime thing, at least for me, and foam is an insulator. Most foam armor costumes are unbearably hot. This one, however, has so many vents, it offers numerous places to put cooling fans. Just keep that in mind. Can we even see the ankles? And the knees are different, so... And that's how he died. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons. These videos just wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. So if you enjoy these builds, want to see more of them, and want your build request to carry a bit more weight, then think about heading on over to the Patreon page, where you can enjoy ad-free early uploads. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving the video quality and shop equipment, as well as allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you on the channel. Alright, hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of the future uploads, because kind of at a totally random schedule. And let me know what other props you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Thanks again, happy crafting, see you later!